Good morning. Wow, that's pretty impressive to have the snake trying to welcome us. Dear President of ICOM France, Emilie, Director of the SMF, welcome to all of you. I am Christophe Leribault from the Chateau of Versailles, and I am delighted to be welcoming you from all four corners of France. I know that some of you have come from Toulouse, Bordeaux, or even overseas. I am delighted to be here together as lovers and professionals of museums working with the fear that we can have sometimes not of meeting together, but given the situations that our institutions are experiencing. So this is something that is shared by all, and we want to discuss together, share our ideas, our challenges, and try to overcome these difficulties together. There will be shared reflection and thinking today. This is at a delicate and key turning point for our institutions. Our museums are in the front line with the restrictions and budget reductions, which is struggling, meaning that we're struggling with our role as conservation and democratization of heritage. There is significant change underway. We have to navigate between budgetary constraints, but also political, climate, and societal issues. Things aren't really that easy when defending the idea of museums. There are multiple challenges facing our institutions, and we are facing unprecedented pressure. For many of us, we need to rethink our professions. Curators and heritage managers have to now be true managers. We need to learn how to manage when we don't have enough. We need to be clever to come up with new ideas. We need to manage our own resources. We need to have boutiques, restaurants, cafes, private space rental. You can actually rent out this auditorium. We didn't ask ICOM to pay, but we need to be exploring these new options. This could be a real opportunity to boost our institutions, to rethink them as places of life where we can be creative in order to adapt our offering, our visits, and reach new targets. In Versailles, our brand is well known, which means that we have high visitor numbers. We are working on sponsorships, partnerships in order to propose new visit experiences, AI assisted visits, augmented reality in our gardens, for example, in order to plunge ourselves into 17th and 18th century life. We will not give up in the face of these issues. When we talk about transformation, we're also going to need to adapt. We're going to need to continue to lead these institutions. We have the responsibility to work differently now. We need to work together with collective intelligence on this mission that we are all following. So thank you so much for being here today. I know many of you are joining us online, sharing ideas so that we can continue to move forward together despite the crisis. After this series of sessions, we will be able to visit the Congress room with Claire. This was where constitutional changes were voted in the past. It's been important for us to bring French members of the public to have awareness raising in schools about the practice in France on the 150th anniversary of the French Republic. I'm going to hand over to Christelle Creff now. Thank you so much for your active and kind support to us all. I wish you all an excellent conference. Thank you. Dear President of the Public Establishment of the Palais Museum and National Estate of Versailles, dear Christophe, dear President of ICOM International, ICOM France, Emilie Girard. So it is a delight for me to take part in the annual Congress of ICOM France. And I would like to thank the organisers for choosing this monument of national heritage. In Reims, we had a wonderful conference last year in the face just opposite the cathedral. Dear Christophe, thank you for your hospitality, your warm welcome here in Versailles. I already said this last year, but this annual congress is a useful time to think about the role of museums and professional practices. I would also like to congratulate you for the discussion evenings and the publications. Throughout the year, this is an opportunity to discuss ethics, sustainable development, the restitution of cultural assets, how to preserve our collections and ensure access to culture. ICOM tries to keep up to date with current events, which can sometimes call into question the activities of museums. This is essential when we want to build, when we want to feed into professional thinking, and also contribute to public policy. These days are an excellent way of measuring the mindset and the state of the museum ecosystem. ICOM's activity shows the maturity of a profession that is able to sit within contemporary issues. So thank you, dear Emilie Girard. Thank you to your office as well and to the ICOM organisers. I know that Christophe Leribault has already said this, but the topic today really does follow on from last year's topic. It's somewhat provoking, dear Emilie, Jean-François, as well. So after growth, we're talking about museums that are facing up to the crisis, committed and innovative museums. We cannot deny that we are in a period of constraint for budgets and also employment, and this is impacting some areas more than others. Christophe Leribault has already made this observation, but there are very important assets in our sector. There is a determined policy for development that has been in place for many decades. I'm not necessarily especially optimistic, but it is important to sit back and look at what we have. We have 1,200 museums in France under the Musée de France certification, and many more besides. There are a whole number of institutional and non-profit stakeholders involved in this. We have very rich and dense collections, exceptional pieces in our museums. All of this is still growing, and this is excellent. So these museums form a lively, a dynamic network promoting the circulation of works across different regions between national and territorial museums. I don't want to make the distinction here between Paris and the countryside, but I want to talk about this in a very national sense. These museums are also using a very different business model. They're using their own funds now, depending on the status and the size of museums, of course, working with sponsors and private funds as well. What I want to say is that these museums have a very diverse professional network. The level of professionalism is very significant. People working in mediation as well, cultural mediation, the skills really have grown within our institutions. They also have strong legal standing since the 2002 law on museums. I'm talking about all museums and not just national museums. French museum expertise is very sought after overseas. This is a strong foundation, but it does not necessarily solve budget problems. The sector is not uniform. Different areas in the country are experiencing this differently. The Minister of Culture is very attentive to fragility that can be observed at the moment, particularly when concerning conservation, the security of collections, but also the scientific support given to institutions, which is essential. Despite all of the difficulties that we will be discussing throughout the day, I think that there is leverage available, and I would like to mention two elected officials that have been supporting us. There's been a lot of work on collections with new presentations of collections, new visits. This speaks to populations and echoes current concerns. These museum collections are put at the level of population. So there are 14 museums in Marseille that did a panorama exhibition presenting many works to the public. There was also a new permanent exhibition in the Music Museum, the National Music Museum. It did not cost a lot of money, but it is proof that we can reinvent ourselves. The second lever that I would like to discuss is about education. In 2002, the law maintained that this was our role. This is continuing in your institutions with remarkable partnerships and mobilization. To wrap up, I would like to say what the Ministry of Culture is doing to support museums that are often controlled by local authorities. The Ministry of Culture supports people through renovation projects. Some are ongoing at the moment, collection works, exhibitions, and some valuation works. The minister wanted to have a new loan package available for rural museums. Around 150 transactions have been funded through this, with small collections, mediation campaigns, security campaigns, so that they can receive loans from national museums, such as the 100 works about climate at the Musée d'Orsay. This has been funding a whole range of smaller renovations at moderate cost. These operations allow museums to restart the impetus in their institutions. At the moment, we need to do better, but with limited resources, and we know that times are tough. It's difficult. We need to be able to be open to all members of the public. This is what we want. So you are going to continue to work on these missions. I know your ambitions are high, and I wish everybody an excellent day. Thank you. Thank you very much, Emilie Girard, for giving me the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of ICOM International to address one of our most innovative and active groups in ICOM. Last year, you were talking about growth. I would have wanted to be with you this year at Versailles once again in order to talk about this theme. which once again looks at crisis. Versailles is a beautiful palace, and it was a kind of totalitarianism that was in Louis XIV time, this palace. But I think we need to mention this. But now the Chateau of Versailles has been open to the public. You can spend some beautiful hours here admiring some wonderful works of art. Unfortunately, I'm in Rome. I'm not in Paris today. Otherwise, I would have loved to have been with you. I'm really moved to speak to you today. This is the final time that I was speaking to you as president of ICOM International, as my mandate will be wrapping up in a few months. Once again, I would like to say that you have been incredibly active, incredibly productive during this difficult period that we have. I hope that I will have the opportunity to see you in Dubai, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the day. Thank you very much. It is now my turn. Thank you so much here, dear Mr. Christophe, President of the Public Establishment of the Chateau Museum and National Museum of Versailles, Head of Museums of France. Christelle, Francesca Pollicini, representative of ICOM International. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I am very pleased to be with you here and online for this event. And I would like to begin by extending my warmest thanks to the team at the Chateau de Versailles for their welcome and their help in preparing this event, which I'm sure has been eagerly awaited. There have been a lot of registration since the summer, and I think this shows how important this event is for all. We are finalizing our budgets, and I'm sure decisions have been made or we are still awaiting them, sometimes anxiously. Many of us have received instructions to be frugal, perhaps even to cut back, and we are reviewing our programs and the changing nature of our activities, reviewing our priorities and trying to manage the human resources of our museums as effectively as possible so as to preserve what is at the heart of our activities and what we cannot and must not give up. We are at a new stage in the development of a movement that began a few years ago and which we have to admit is set to continue. For our museums, it's no longer just a question of getting through a difficult period, but of learning to deal with it and above all to do things differently. So how do we adapt? We wanted to build this day not as a catalogue of disillusionment, and that's important, but instead as a source of inspiration. For several years now, museums have been trying to invent new models, in particular new methods of funding, in order to develop their own resources and become less independent on public funding. But external income is not plentiful and is not inexhaustible, and economic difficulties are not confined to just the public sector. Faced with this situation, our imaginations are working hard to bring about real, lasting, and sustainable change. How can we continue to respond to the need to conserve and disseminate, but with more limited resources? How can we continue to be a museum in an unfavorable economic context that is undergoing total transformation? The current situation is forcing museum professionals to think differently about their jobs and their missions. There are many initiatives in France and overseas to test new ways of operating, pooling, co-productions, economic partnerships designed on a regional scale, new customer loyalty programs, building better integration into the local fabric, circles of patrons, participatory funding campaigns, innovative sponsorship, and more. This day of discussions will highlight these experiments, these different experiences, which often intersect with concerns about ecological sustainability and greater social involvement in the work of museums. How can museums be designed to strike a balance with their social and economic environment? How can we imagine museums that are more integrated into society, where the story told by the institution resonates with its partners and creates a strong, stable bond, a sense of attachment? I would like to thank all the speakers and the moderators who agreed to take part in this day. The preparatory meetings we have held promise to be rich in debate. I would also like to extend my warmest thanks to the teams at the Château de Versailles for their warm welcome and their commitment to preparing this event. In particular, Corinne Tepo-Capacé, Sébastien Zimmermann, Antoine Roucher, Baptiste Van Belle, Claire Bonnot, Mathilde Cassandro-Malfait, and Denis Verdier-Magnaud. My thoughts also go to the ICOM France Executive Committee, Valérie Guillaume, Marie Grasse, Laurent Ménétrier, Frédéric Ladonne et Florence Lecor. They are reaching the end of their mandate, so I do think of them. Thank you to the entire board for their commitment to the life of our association and to the scientific committee that meets to prepare each of our events. Finally, a word to the ICOM France team, hiding in the technical part of the room. You know them well. Anne-Claude Maurice, Alexia Maquinet, who is not here, and I don't think it's a secret to any of you to say that she is on maternity leave. Camilla Chiachi and Léane Coupin, who has just joined the team, as well as Julie Bersmith, who arrived today. So thank you again to the translators, and this allows our foreign colleagues to attend the event. Thank you to Ms. Schwartz and Mr. Michel for taking notes live, which will enable us to publish the proceedings. Finally, thank you all for attending this event, both here and online. I wish you all a good and profitable day, and I'd like to now give the floor to Jean-François Chougnet, who has kindly agreed to open the event.
Good morning, everybody. As Christophe Leribault reminded us, museums today, unlike what happened in the past, is no longer something that's just obvious for everybody in the situation we live in today. ICOM France's invitation to talk about a crisis, I tried to do some research because I think it might be the first time in the history of ICOM we have chosen the word crisis for the theme of a professional day. I was thinking that I think I found something in the archive that was something about the interwar period, but thank you to Emilie Girard and the ICOM executive board for giving me this theme. So I just want to explain a little bit how I've tried to look at this from a bit of a different angle. So I'm going to be giving you a little bit of some bad boy remarks, as it were, that I will be polite. So I've chosen to call my talk The Open Museum and Its Enemies. That might surprise some of you, but in reference to Karl Popper's book, which is exactly 80 years old today by a coincidence of the calendar, but it was only translated into French in the end of the 1970s, and it's somewhat out of fashion these days. Popper, as you know, was a philosopher of science, and he had this thought which really led to one certainty, which is uncertainty, and that connects a lot into what we're going to be talking about today. And that seems to me a good way to open up this subject. We are here in Versailles in one of the two philosophers of Molière's Mariage Forcé, the forced marriage, which is currently presented by the Comédie Française in a fairly caustic version, and was already talking about this uncertainty. Alongside Popper's open society, the historical evolution of the museum over the last 2.5 centuries has also been the story of an extraordinary openness around the themes, technicity, political questions, to such an extent that William Rubin, the historic director of the MoMA, warned in vain, it seems, that the concept of museums is not infinitely extensible. And unfortunately, a lot of people think differently. But the museum's incessant mutations reveal its capacity to integrate critical reflection, but at the same time, I think we've all been struck by this. This has always struck me in my decades of working professionally in museums. It's interesting to see that museums never really look at themselves with a critical gaze. And I think one of the things that we're wanting to look at today is have something of a critical perspective on museums today. So I wanted to look a little bit about who are the enemies of the museum today and in the past, because I think the crisis, and this is a theme that we're going to be coming back to throughout the day, but because the crisis we're facing is not just an economic crisis, and I think it would be a mistake to say everything's going fine. The concept is really very stable. I think we need to understand that this crisis that we're in also is connected into a fundamental question. Perhaps ideological would be the wrong word, because that would be ready to start the debate, but this is not something that's new. I tried to remember, as the failed historian that I am, since I ended up in museums, but I was thinking about an article by Rémi Labrousse on museum phobia. He's got a few publications on this. He's got these first museumophobia editions that he produced. And here I'm quoting him. Unlike collections, an immemorial anthropological fact of which all cultures since the Paleolithic seem to show signs, the museum, in its contemporary sense, is neither self-evident nor a necessity, so much so that it could even not exist. I think that's a very interesting reflection. Rémi Labrousse lists a genealogy that began simultaneously with the modern museum of the 18th century, and you have the photo of the cover of this text with Quatre Mères de Quincy, who spoke of a strange contradiction, a vicious circle, which is truly bizarre. He denounced a cult of images detached from their destination. In a text entitled Museums and Their Enemies, I think subconsciously I think I copied this without actually realizing this, because I found this text after I'd already suggested the title. So Museums and Their Enemies. This is a text by Francis Haskell. He analyzed Quatre-Mères-Quincy's positions. You can see the text in front of you. And this lecture was delivered for the 4th centenary of the Uffizi in Florence and was published in the Proceedings, Social Science Proceeding in 1983, in a journal directed by Pierre Bourdieu. And so this came out in French in 1983, in French. And he recalls the anecdote of Quatre Mères de Quincy that some of you will know, who in his youth had been deeply moved by Lebrun's Sainte Madeleine renonçant aux vanités du monde in the Carmelite convent, Sainte Madeleine renouncing the vanities of the world. And he said, what emotions, what memories attached to the walls alone that contained this painting? These walls have disappeared, and within the enchanting procession of ideas and illusions that embellish the work of this brush, this faded painting, exhibited in pompous galleries to the vain curiosity of cold critics, no longer appeared anything but a pale copy of itself. It barely caught the eye. I saw it, and I turned my eyes away. So I won't go into the full length of the title, because it was a 15-line, almost a 15-line title, moral considerations of the purpose of works of art, etc., etc., etc. That was kind of the long title that we had at the time. And Haskell finally adds, things have changed since Quatre Mères, if only because many of the works of art he saw torn from their original environment have since spent more time in museums than in the churches and palaces for which they were created, and they find themselves haloed by a halo of new associations. I think this is something we could accept, is that the natural environment of these works is no longer churches or places where they used to be, but it ends up to be, they end up in museums where they have been for many decades, these works. So there are many occurrences of this museumophobia. I'll try to be fairly quick with this. There are some fairly well-known texts at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Perhaps I could just mention one which was really had a lot of success at the beginning of the 20th century, a text by Robert de la Cizéran, who fought against what he called the prisons of art. Some of you know him, of course, and you know his criticism of the Impressionists, and also he was somewhat against museums as well. And this reflection was in the Questions esthétiques contemporaines, which was published in 1904. And yet, if we can look at the next slide, there is Marinetti's Manifesto of Futurism. So this is a page of the Figaro newspaper, published in 1909. And you will see that this quote is fairly problematic for the associations working with him. He says, "We want to demolish museums and libraries, fight moralism, feminism, and all opportunistic and utilitarian cowardice." So associations that work with this manifesto of futurism are not always very at ease with these kind of remarks. And then around this period of time, there was a question which was quite fashionable at the time, is about whether we should burn down the Louvre. And I'll just give you just a few examples of this, because there was really quite a lot of literature around this whole question. In fact, there's work to be done and to be done further around the work of Rémy Lebrusse. There's work on Rémy Lebrusse, but that hasn't yet covered a lot of this, because he actually made a lot of contribution to this question. I think there are some students who could really work on this question. There was even a review which was founded by people who supported the Grand Palais. And he launched a survey in the magazine L'Esprit Nouveau in 1921 about whether the Louvre should be burnt down. And there were a number of key figures which wrote and contributed to this review. The real birth of the theme of destroying the Louvre in the art world seems to be attributed to Cézanne, since his biographer, Joachim Gesquet, that you know, he says that Cézanne, at some point during his youth, he said, "We must burn the Louvre down." But in his interviews with Cézanne, who was much older, he said, and this is cited by Gasquet, and we assume that this is the truth, he said, "Before, my ideas were confused. Life, life, that was the only word on my lips. I wanted to burn down the Louvre, you idiot. You have to go to the Louvre through nature and return to nature through the Louvre." I think it's really very beautiful. I love this quote. And to this famous question about the Louvre, André Farcy, someone that we all admire very much, he was the brilliant curator, an amateur curator nonetheless, of the Grenoble Museum, and he was able to save the honor of French museums in that time. And in reply to the question, he said very quickly, "Keep trying. You can always try, and you'll see if the fire brigade, in inverted commas, opposite arrive in time. So in terms of fire brigade, you need to, of course, put in a capital letter and think it back to the time then, because at the time it was the Fine Arts Museum that was opposite the Louvre, the Fine Arts School, and not the Musée d'Orsay. And then we need to remember Paul Valérie's article as well on the problem of museums, which was published in Le Gaulois. And you've got the first page here. This was the front page. And he said on the 4th of April 1923, he said, "I don't really like museums. There are many admirable ones, but none that are really delightful." So he was already denigrating this idea. The ideas of classification, conservation, and public utility, which are right and clear, have little to do with delight. At the first step I take towards beautiful things, a hand takes away my cane, and a document forbids me to smoke. So you can see that the public policies were already having a quite authoritarian approach. Already chilled by the authoritarian gesture and the feeling of constraint, I enter some sculpture room where cold confusion reigns, he said. Then he went on to say, the ear cannot bear to hear 10 orchestras at once. The mind can neither follow nor conduct several distinct operations, and there's no simultaneous reasoning. But the eye, in the opening of its mobile angle and in the instant of its perception, finds itself obliged to omit a portrait and a marine, a kitchen and a triumph, and characters in the most different states and dimensions. This in no way prevented the Republic from entrusting him with writing the immortal aphorisms at the Palais de Chaillot, such as, "In these walls dedicated to wonders, I welcome and guard the works of the prodigious hand of the artist." We did the Juno exhibition in 2019 at the Museum, and I wrote in the catalogue at the time about this writer who was a great art lover, and he was part of this anti-museum movement. He wasn't the only one. He had a different perspective than Valérie. They were on very different sides of the political spectrum. So Jeannot was on these days. We would say he was on the far left in the 1920s, but he felt that museums reduced sensations. He's not far from perhaps the ideas of the young Cézanne at the beginning of the century. At the same time, there was the American philosopher John Dewey, who had this book Art as Experience from 1934, which was translated into French. This is my copy, but it's a bit tired. But it was translated into French in 2005, only 2005. So we can't say that in 1934 it had an impact in the French-speaking world, but it already impacted the English-speaking world at that point. And he had a fairly radical modern critique of the museum, which is really quite interesting to read. And so there's this text which is read a lot today because he connects into this anti-museum sentiment. He says, our current museums in which works of art are taken away and stored are a good illustration of one of the causes that have led to the total isolation of art. Most European museums are, among other things, monuments to the rise of nationalism and imperialism. Every capital must have its own museum of painting, sculpture, etc., devoted in part to displaying the treasures amassed by its successive monarchs during the conquest of other nations. So you can see that these are things that could have been written just last week in terms of its modernity. And then he adds in, the rise of capitalism exerted a powerful influence on the development of museums as places to house works of art and helped to spread the idea that works of art are not part of everyday life. In the 20th century, anti-museum criticism, as you know, we are all familiar with these texts and thinking, and it was often, this kind of thinking was often voiced by artists rather than philosophers. I'll come back to this later, but you will see that things evolve over time. But here we can mention Jean Dubuffet, who, as we know, claimed to be a nihilist, and he castigated, I think there's a picture on the slide, he castigated these mortuaries of embalming, these citadels of Mandarin culture that are museums. This was written in Asphyxiating Culture, which was published in 1968. I don't know if we can publish the image here. He wrote, "The property-owning caste, aided by its clerics, that's us, makes no mistake about it. When it opens its castles, museums, and libraries to the people, it does not want them to get the idea of devoting themselves to creation. It is not writers or artists that the property-owning class, by means of its cultural propaganda, intends to arouse, but readers and admirers. On the contrary, cultural propaganda endeavors to make the people feel the abyss that separates them from these prestigious treasures to which the ruling class holds the keys, and the futility of any attempt to make a valid creative work outside the paths it has marked out." So this is just a small extract of this text, which we read less, but it had a lot of influence after 1968. Even Dubuffet had a lot to say about personal capitalism. He felt it was more mimicry than a political situation. More fruitful and above all more subtle is the work of Marcel Brudias's, which I've illustrated with his the cover of his book, which aligns therefore with the intellectual property rights and copyright rights. If I use the covers, so in his self-criticism of his Musée d'Art Moderne and the Eagle department, he says, "I was born in 1924. I became an artist in 1963. I founded a museum in 1968. I buried the museum in 1972, and I became an artist again the same year." So you can see the idea of this. You perhaps saw the recreation of this this museum that was done in the 1960s. Of course, the motif of the eagle for a German audience talks about the denunciation of authoritarianism, of course. And you might have seen at the Monnaie de Paris, the Paris Mint, in 2015, that this project was recreated, and there were fragments of these different sections. The same year, in 1972, a group of experts, which was managed by Harold Zillman and included Pontius Pilton, Georges-Henri Rivière, Pierre Gaudibert, and they reflected on the relationship between museums and contemporary art. They said the function of the museum is linked to the function of art, and like the latter, it changes over time. I'm not going to read this entire quote, but just a part of it. The result has been a democratization that is now calling into question the old structure of the museum, still based on the criterion of artistic competition. We continue to take the artist as our starting point, but we're increasingly looking at his or her work in terms of its relationship with the community. So in this text, which is really very interesting and is worth having a good look at, he went into the conflicted relationship with contemporary art that museums have. It's really very interesting. And you can find it in Anthology of New Museology in a publication called Vague Waves. So this is really the anti-museum movement of the 20th century, and there's this conflicted relationship with contemporary art, where museums have always been places that have both been valued and contested. Both Lucy Lippard, art critic, talks about both the hand that feeds and the citadel to storm. At the end of the 1980s, primarily in the English-speaking world. France was a lot more peaceful at that time. We were really in the period of Jacques Lang period, and we were really focusing on opening lots of museums at that time. But there was a lot of crisis in the English-speaking world, a lot of debate and discussion anyway, and a lot of activism among North American museums around fighting against the AIDS crisis that museums really highlighted. There was the regular protest, the Day Without Art, which was put in place. There were also some feminist protests, and this has been mentioned in the work of the Guerrilla Girls, this painting where they count the number of girls present in the Metropolitan Museum, where 80% of them are naked, of course, because the representation of women in museums tends to be a nude representation, and a lot of people who can't mention all of this. But then this movement went on to the protest of 2017, the 20th of January 2017, when Donald Trump assumed his first presidency, and there was a call for strike by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, targeting what its organizers described as the toxic philanthropy of the museum's management. Or there's the more recent protests, strike MoMA, where there was a boycott of the MoMA. I wasn't directly targeting the MoMA, but it was actually here at this point that they were talking about museum society. So this leads us to just thinking through a number of these different areas. Perhaps we could move on to the next slide, and I'm just going to mention the 21st century, which is the hardest period to work on. With decolonized museums, the creator and critic Shimrit Lee draws on this activist movement and seeks to trace the colonial origins of the museum concept. For her, the atrocities committed by the colonial powers were masked by narratives of benign curiosity and respect for the occupied or annihilated culture, and these racist narratives, according to Lee, are still integral to the authority wielded by museums today. So there is this anti-colonial, anti-patriarchal movement in museums which raise questions about the existence and role of museums today. And this critic uses a whole number of museums, from the Metropolitan Museum up to Indiana Jones. It's a really very interesting book, which is a lot more subtle than the title suggests. So perhaps we've perhaps read this less than the second book on the screen, which I won't go into a great deal, because it starts by reminding us with a lot of history, but I haven't got the time to go into detail on that. It reminds us of recent events when members of Extinction Rebellion sprayed various products on paintings or stuck themselves to their frames in order to protest against the inaction of governments in the face of global warming. And the author then notes that the reactions of museum directors echoes similar reactions 20 years ago when they collectively refused the restitution of objects. Of course, we could start talking about all of that, and I think there's probably more to say about all of that, but perhaps more subtly, even though this was there was never anything really published about this, but I remember we organized a session with Paul B. Preciado in Malaga, and he developed analysis of the museum phenomenon in various papers, including in a seminar organized by the Centre Pompidou. And he said the museum is a space that appeals to the entire sensibility. But what body is made visible in a museum? Who's looking? Who's being looked at? Under what conditions? Who has access to the supposedly artistic and sophisticated gaze? So this was a fairly subtle perspective, and it'd be worth inviting him back again, perhaps to an ICOM gathering, because the more he works, the more he works on museums, and I hope that one day he'll publish on this question, because I think there's some really interesting things that he has to say here. He's perhaps broken away simply from seeing it as museums as colonial and patriarchal institutions. This is all the case of Benedict Savoy. And this this work has been translated. So this is the case of Savoy. So, and she asked this question, who does beauty belong to? So this is a seminar work that was published, and she says that the issue of restitution and heritage justice is not new. She says the arguments on both sides don't seem to have changed much since Caesar's speeches against Verres in 70 BC, in which he sought to recover what the Carthaginians had plundered in Sicily in the 3rd century BC, and which Rome subsequently recovered. She calls these, and I think this is really interesting, heritage translocations, which might be a slightly difficult term. I don't know whether you heard this, because there was an interruption through the translation, but she talked about this context, which summarizes the question here. So she wraps up her seminar and her book by saying that a shared and universal heritage will remain futile as long as 3/4 of humanity are not free to travel and continue to be deprived of this heritage. And I think this is something definitely worth hearing. I think it's true what's said. The final example that I will mention, and then I will wrap up, is the book published by Dan Hicks, which is really very interesting. This is the professor of contemporary archaeology at Oxford University, and he is a curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is a university museum, a museum where there are which received the Pitt Rivers collection. He 5 years ago published an essay with the title "The Brutish Museums," and this was hailed as one of the best art books of 2020 by the New York Times. And just before the summer of 2025, he published a new book called "Every Monument Will Fall," whose title, in its own right, says a lot. He starts with the museum that he leads, the Pitt Rivers Museum. That's the beginning of the book. He starts with the book with lot 211, a drinking bowl in the shape of a human skull with a silver rim. Underneath is inlaid a Victoria shilling, and all around is a Greek inscription: "Drink before you load yourself with this dust." It was acquired at auction in 1884 by Lieutenant General August Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, and it undoubtedly came from outside Europe. And this macabre skull was donated to Worcester College in Oxford in 1946 by his grandson. And until the mid-2010s, it remained because it was part of the collection. And unusually for a museum object, it was periodically used in the senior common room of the college as a wine goblet. And then after it began to leak, as a chocolate holder for dessert. So he starts with that. And he talks about the fact that this monument to erasure and dehumanization and naming is the starting point for Dan Hicks' discourse against a conservative public culture of commemoration that still honors colonialism, racism, and militaristic realism. And so this book was very provocative and created a lot of reaction. As Tristram Hunt, our colleague who's director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, he noted in a review which was published in PLS, a Times Literature supplement, in July 25, he said the author has delivered a supercharged mix of biography, polemic, and psychogeography, interweaving the life of Pitt Rivers with the institutional history of his eponymous museum. The curator is particularly in favor of abolishing museums, all of which exist in a state of denial of their failed narratives and historical cooptation for white supremacist purposes. A point of optimism is Hicks at the end of his book. He doesn't necessarily want the total end of museums, because what he wants is to make it possible for the world of art and culture to keep up with the times. We can continue our debate today because museums are not finished. Tristram Hunt finds this book very interesting, even if it's very radical, and he says, we have not suppressed history or neutralized memory. He's talking about what he thinks about the V&A, but he says, speaking about his own museum and museums in general, he says, we have done our job by drawing greater public and critical attention to multiple and cumulative pasts. So I'll end there because I think drawing attention to multiple and cumulative pasts may possibly be one of the answers to the crisis. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dear President of ICOM France, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here in Versailles, and it's been brilliant to listen to Jean-François's keynote that really did paint a very interesting picture of this anti-museum sentiment. It really is quite complex and quite remarkable. So I'm delighted to be here. So thank you to all of ICOM and the Museum of Versailles that has given us an excellent welcome here. So thank you as well to Emilie, Girard, and to the board at ICOM as well. Thank you for allowing me to moderate this session. When we talk about crisis, one of the first remarks we make is that crisis is perhaps not the adequate term, in that crisis is often a short-lived event that could be solved quite quickly through immediate intervention, sometimes creatively or sometimes with a very clear protocol. What's happening today is less a matter of crisis with an immediate phenomenon that could be resolved through protocol or inventiveness. It is instead something that is there latently with different degrees of significance, urgency. Museums in France have been facing this. It's difficult to say whether it's since 2008 or whether it's since the mid 2000s. Is it post-COVID? But in any case, it's been present now for 10 to 20 years. So this is something that's not happening in a moment. We're not going to be able to resolve it to go back to something that we had previously. It's actually something that we're going to be needing transformation for. Christelle, Emilie, and Jean-François have mentioned this. We need to pay attention to transformation, and perhaps, as we just heard as well, we need to question our own disappearance. It's always good to ask ourselves this question as museums, ask ourselves about our own extinction. What I mean by this is to ask ourselves the question of why we are here, what our purpose is. Questioning our presence is something that I consider to be very important. So this idea that's going to underpin this first session is the fact that this crisis is here, but not as a one-off. It's going to call us to deeper reflection. And that's what all of the professionals here today will be sharing. It will be a pleasure to be hearing from each of them. This is also what many of you are doing, trying to move towards new avenues and new information. This is perhaps a little bit more drastic and it feels stronger than previously, particularly regarding the question of the role, the place of museums, their intention, their role in the cultural and educational space, and also in the social and political life of our culture, of our country. So the answers, which are sometimes brutal across some different areas, is very different. I wanted to look if there were any rationales around the size or geographical area explaining this kind of response, but no. And that's good. It means that it's not rational in that sense. Some of you working in museums are facing increasing restrictions that are calling into question the reality of the presence of your institution. This is essential, and we need to bear this in mind. That said, when we talk about this strength, like always, it's not all about the money that we don't have. This is a consequence, a symptom, often a symptom of a museum narrative that is not heard as it was previously. Perhaps it's no longer expressed as it was, how it should have been, how it should be today by museums themselves. This idea of what is the role of the narrative of a museum. How are museums going to enter into their social and political role as well as their cultural role? In this panel discussion, I think it will be essential to ask questions about our role in with regard to politics and political authorities. We are dependent on them for funding, obviously, but perhaps we could also see any proposals, past or present, to rebuild this bridge, to put the museum back at the heart of village life, if you allow me to express it this way. So, what is possible to remind people of our existence today and also in the future? Because the real strength of museums is that they are rooted in the past, in the present, but also the future. The question of the museum's impermanence, as Jean-François said earlier, is incredibly complex, and the time frame for this is going to raise a lot of interesting questions. for this roundtable panel discussion, we have a very prestigious panel here today. We have Valérie Perlès, who is the director of the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire pour l'Éluard in Saint-Denis. We have Laurent Védrine, director of the Bordeaux Museums, Michèle Rivet as well, who is museologist and consultant, Jean-Michel Tobelem, professor in Paris 1, but also director and founder of the research and consulting company Option Culture, and also Guillaume Désanges, president of the Palais de Tokyo. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. Today we are going to have a roundtable discussion with 3 questions where each speaker will be able to answer after preparing this together, and then there will be a question and answer session at the end of the panel discussion so that you can respond. So we prepared some questions together that we felt very significant. So faced with these structural reductions in public loans, what measures have you taken, both from a financial and budgetary point of view? But also, as I mentioned briefly in my introduction, how have you positioned your institution differently? So if you allow me, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues here to be as brief and as illustrative as possible. And please do mention any projects that you have. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. The Palais de Tokyo is unique as it was created in 2002 with a lot of its own income. It's always been able to navigate on 2 legs. So it's had public subsidies, but also its own income and private income. This has allowed it a certain kind of stability compared with what I had been told when I arrived in this institution. I was quite afraid about what people were telling me about this difficult to govern machine. But having this corporate culture to a certain extent as well meant that we had a sort of resilience and quite an original business model. And it has shown itself to be solid since 2002. However, like many institutions, we are now facing 2 contradictory forces. They're actually going in the same direction. Maybe it's not so contradictory. So we have a decline in subsidies, or uncertainty perhaps is more clear in order to express this more positively. Uncertainty on that level. And the second point, and I think this is true for all institutions, there has been an increase in costs and bills, not just linked to inflation, but also linked to new considerations, social, ecological, societal considerations that all have a cost. On that basis, in the Palais de Tokyo, we've not had to reinvent our model. As I said, we've had quite a virtuous model from the start. But with our relationships in the private sector with businesses, we've been able to implement some actions that take into account modifications to the relationships we have with corporates. So we have skills-based sponsorship, initiatives-based sponsorship, rather than just having the gift of money. That's something that I could talk about. So we've introduced 2 sponsorship circles. They're very specific. What I mean by this is that they're aligned with the societal goals of the institution. At the Palais de Tokyo, we have 2 main focuses of work. So first of all, ecology. How can we support the ecological transition of our institution? And I'm not just talking about exhibitions about trees. I'm talking about rethinking our entire business model in order to manage our working pace, the use of spaces, etc. And the second is about mental health. And I launched this when arriving. So we have an AMO area called, which is our educational zone, and we have a real focus on health and mental health. We started with what we were and then moved towards what we wanted to be, a contemporary museum linked to societal issues within our exhibitions, but also within our way of operating. We have two circles, so one based on mental health and one based on ecology and being environmentally friendly. We've been inventing partnerships here where it's not just about financial gifts. There are obviously financial gifts, but we're working on skills, working with these businesses. We're creating projects together that look at both the institution and also the company that we're working with. This is a way of raising awareness through art, through artistic forms, through the eyes of the artist, to look at what issues we have in common in both the cultural and economic worlds. Thank you so much, Guillaume. I really like this paradox that instability has actually created a new kind of stability. That's something to think about together. So, Valérie, you are head of the Éluard Museum in Saint-Denis. It's quite different to what we just heard, and not too far in terms of geographical distance. That's an interesting point to consider. But you are currently drawing up cultural policy and cultural strategy for your institution. Partnerships really is at the heart of your scientific project. So I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you so much, Dominique. I'm not going to talk about policy and science straight away, but I will get into partnerships because we're talking here about funding. The idea is not to explain how we handle our funding, how we go to different levels, how we build our budget. But it's to explain how we work with local resources. In Saint-Denis, there are a lot of them, they're very varied, but they do require us to question our professional practice, our view of heritage, and to make sure that we're adaptable, that we can adapt to the needs that can differ from those of museums. In Saint-Denis, like in other cities, we have a lot of cultural services. They're of different kinds. We have an archaeological service, also specialized hip hop rooms, concert halls. That's quite unique. We have cultural partners that are very dynamic, like a dance company, Fli de Coufflet. We also have the Saint-Denis Festival. There are lots of different things, and we're learning to work together. And we see active participation from them in our cultural program. It's about content, but also to try and win over new public, new audience members through this. So we work with universities as well. There's Paris 8 University in Saint-Denis. It doesn't take a day to build a project. We need to take the time to get to know one another, see what we have in common. The master program of history at Paris 8 came to see us because they were thinking about their curriculum. They wanted to give students greater exposure to professions. We have a partnership around an exhibition that we're preparing for 2027 on hip hop. The students carried out a number of surveys for this, and I think they will be involved in cultural mediation as well. With Paris 8, we are also working with the photography department. Students would like to present their final year work at the museum. This is high level work. We thought that this could be a way of learning to work together and to ensure that students' projects can be fully integrated into our program. So there's different stages to our partnership program, and that's what makes it so interesting. Regarding nonprofits, associations, we work with a lot of local organizations. There's a new nonprofit that has just been created that is building quite a lot of momentum across different historians associations. We were there when they launched their first meeting. We've tried to be a resource for them, but also a place where they can share their work. So this is going to enrich our collections through the different surveys and collections, testimonials and objects that are being defined through this association. And we're also working in something completely experimental. And this is a real work in progress. We've created a something we call the Carmel Tapel, as we're in a 17th century Carmel building. So this is where a non-profit can come into the museum and do programs with a project that they want. This is called free reign, a white card, as they say in French, and this gives them free reign to do what they want. There have been conference sessions on prevention, proposals linked to the internal sociability of associations. This is completely connected to social and heritage questions. We wanted to know whether we would accept this proposal or if we would try to align them better with our vision of museums, but welcoming in these associations and providing rooms is a way of building familiarity, getting to know local residents and helping them take ownership of the place as well. So we're thinking with teams about how we can handle these proposals from the nonprofit sector, even if sometimes the culture and the strategies are quite far removed from those of museums. Thank you so much, Valérie. We really can see the multifaceted nature of museums through its space, through its history, through its collections, through its position. It can open to different partners with issues as well. How far can we go? How can we transform? Laurent Védrine, I'm going to hand over to you now. In Bordeaux, there have also been a certain number of experiences of networking, of innovative developments, and you're going to be able to tell us a little bit more about this. Yes, thank you so much. If you could move forward onto the next slide, that would be very helpful. Just to show you what I'm talking about a museum. This is a municipal museum. There are 5 municipal museums in Bordeaux. And this is right at the heart of the city centre. This is a very tourist city as well. There's the Museum of History and Society. For many years, there has been an original system associated with this for the redistribution of some income. It's very pragmatic, what I'm going to say here when talking about funding. So the municipal system means that we are a department within the municipal services of the city of Bordeaux. Municipal museums, if you move on to the next slide, have the possibility to redistribute their own resources. So in multiple ways. So the first is through ticketing, to do with the cost of entry, which is €8 to visit the Musée d'Aquitaine. There is a system of redistribution of some of the income generated from municipal museums. We could perfect our system further. There's a system here known as large exhibitions. So every year we try to distribute these between the museums and to share the financial opportunities in order to promote different exhibitions. Next slide now. We also generate income through the gift shop. The gift shop is very important. So just to clarify, the budget is voted on every year, and this is distributed the following year. It is essential. We get the double of what we get from ticket sales in our gift shop. So if you want 30,000 euros to launch the shop, anything you generate beyond that will be redistributed back into the museum. So if we move on to the next slide, I put some cake molds here. There's a speciality in Bordeaux called the cannelé. It's a type of very sweet caramel cake. Here are some cake molds. It's just to give you an idea of the quality, the way that we can support local manufacturers as well. And it's a way of generating margin. It's extremely important for us. It can also generate mobilization for teams, knowing that they can rely on the redistribution of income, at least in part, in order to re-inject into cultural projects the following year through these decision-making processes I outlined. So in the next slide, now I just wanted to talk about the third aspect, which is about privatization, rental of spaces and venues. We have around 40% of income through this. Once again, I don't have any other examples. I would love to know if there are any other local authorities, any other territorial museums that use this system. The first thing I'd like to say is that people generally say, no, it's not possible. Everything is in a common pot. But here I can testify by example that there is a way of re-injecting income into the life of an institution. Issues associated with sponsorship as well, that's an area that we want to develop further. We're trying to pool certain functions in sponsorship instead of being broken up between our 5 institutions. There are 2 people working full time now on sponsorship to prevent competition between our institutions. This will allow us to be a little bit more efficient in seeking out sponsorship and also the possibility of subsidies as well. We've already mentioned this. And it was interesting to hear about the skills-based sponsorship as well. And all of this is re-injected through this decision-making process in order to support our cultural program. I've put my contact information here and my financial and admin staff as well. If you have any questions, please do reach out. Thank you so much, Laurent, for this really unique point for everything you've mentioned. I would now like to hand over to Michèle Rivet, who contributed to the report in 2005 Museum and Public Funding. This is in public funding World Answer a museum. So it's about the global responses. This was funded by ICOM IMREC under the director of Yves Vergent. And you were scientific director here. This was over 2 years, this study, if I'm not mistaken. And it's based on a quantitative study sent to all ICOM national committees. And I think it gives you something quite objective as far as possible and also something quite consolidated. So I'm just going to hand over to you so you can give some context. This is a report that kept us busy over 2 years, but I would like to thank you at ICOM France for inviting me to take part in this panel discussion. It is incredibly interesting. What you've said so far really does impress me. In Canada, we have quite a unique status between ICOM Canada and ICOM France, and I'll come back to this later. We have been able to work quite closely together on the definition of museum. Juliette, we worked on this in 2009 after Kyoto and also in Prague. So very quickly, following on from this study, I was scientific director of this. Thank you for reminding us of this, dear moderator. We wanted to look at where museum funding was at. Was there a crisis? We didn't know. Perhaps there wasn't one. Obviously, we already know the answer to this. So, for 2 years, we carried out this study, sending questionnaires to all national ICOM committees. We received 59 responses that were statistically valid, working with experts from Oceania, Africa, I think it was from South Africa, in Asia, North and South America, Europe. We looked at how 119 selected museums worked across the world in order to identify where we were at, what we were doing, what museums were doing, what they could do better. At the end of this, there was very interesting feedback. We looked into things a little bit further back in time. We went back to the financial crisis of 2008 to see what the impact was. And then, of course, with COVID, and to see where we're at now. The questionnaire really was very long. We were told that the questionnaire was a little bit too long, but we got very interesting answers. And very quickly, I'll come back to this later. The observations were, yes, as we know, there has been a decline in funding, that this decline in funding in absolute figures, or alternatively, people said that funding had not declined, but the multiplication of missions, of assignments by a museum means that with the same funding that has never been indexed, it's never increased, we have to do a lot more. There has been a constant multiplication of museums across the world. We know that the pool of resources is now the same size or perhaps a little bit smaller, and there's increased competition between museums and the need to come together in order to work better together now. We also observed that the money within museums had to contribute to so many different assignments and missions, such as cybersecurity and many other examples, which means that it's challenging to define a priority now because there are so many. What we have identified from the museums asked that we met, that we asked, is a kind of entrepreneurship. We really do have to be on the attack. We need to understand how things work. We need to know that museums are not just museums that do conservation, mediation, working on with the museum that they're serving, working with the society that they're serving. I will wrap up soon, but I just wanted to give another general observation. Museums need to work to be able to be sustainable in the long term, not just with one-off funding for a specific thing. They need to use different methods, and we'll come back to those mechanisms. They need to have different working methods to be able to establish budgets, not just on an annual level, but also with predictions about what we might get in the years to come. There are so many other observations, but I will stop there. Thank you so much, dear moderator.
Thank you very much. You talked about these perhaps entrepreneurial approaches and this possibility of being active and going towards others. And I think that does, of course, open up the risk of us losing who we are and what we're about, because museums are not simply an economic player like others. So Jean-Michel Tobelem, perhaps I could hand over to you just for another perspective, because through your consulting firm, I think you might have a different perspective, and also your role as an academic. And you like to remind us that there is, as Michèle said, that there is still a desire for museums. Yes, thank you very much. There's a lot of us that have heard for many decades now that perhaps there was a kind of drop off of public support for museums, but if that was the case, then we should be fairly low today. And just to give you an idea of an order of magnitude, because sometimes when we look at these things, if we look, for example, at the Ministry of Culture budget, which is well represented in public spending, but this public spending is over 20 billion, so it's around 20 and 25 billion euros a year. And over and against the general opinion, the state's contribution is higher than local authorities. And so the state, including all sectors, including tax credits and exoneration, etc., we're around 10 and 15 billion from the state. So that's the state contribution. So another perspective would be to do with the announcements that we've heard recently, particularly from regions and the department level in France. So the regions, it's true, are the least significant partner in terms of cultural funding. And for the département, the French département, of course, they have a number of different roles, even although they do intervene in the museum and culture world, which is beyond the scope really of their main work. And so if we see there are about 40 different projects that represent around 900 million euros. So that's significant. These are renovation works, building works, and that's significant. Of course, you might say that they might be stopped. There are going to be local elections coming up, so it's possible there could be changes. But I think local councillors will want to show that they've been working well and succeeding it during their mandate. And then we hear all these announcements from national museums who talk about projects for tens and hundreds of millions of euros. So I'm not wanting to minimize the difficulties we're encountering, because it's true that even if the sums remain fairly stable, we could say that there is the inflation, the increase of energy prices, the wage payroll costs, which of course are reducing the scope of the activity of museums. So that is the case. But I just want to counterbalance a bit the idea of a general crisis. So in terms of what we heard from Jean-François Chougnet, is there a kind of stepping back from museums in a new way? Well, maybe not, because really the question we're working on today, but we could have the same kind of question with stakeholders from the performing arts sector, who are really very worried. Partly, and this is a question shared with all cultural stakeholders, but we could also have the same discussion with stakeholders from the medical world, the social world, from the research world, universities, because everyone is facing difficulties and challenges. We're not trying to minimize the difficulties encountered by museums, but we're trying to just balance things out a bit. We'll come back to this later because it's worth going into this in detail, because if there is a kind of stepping back and a lowering of interest in museums, this is not something that is shared around the world, because really we can see an explosion of museums in many countries around the world. So museums are far from being considered as a outdated institution. In terms of funding in itself, what I think is that most solutions proposed have been on the table now for quite a long time. When these different packages of and approaches for increasing resources have not been experimented with, it makes sense to think, well, let's have a go if we can get them working. Nevertheless, during the COVID period, we saw meetings of experts at a national, international level who really stayed with the idea that the solutions that are being experimented with at the moment were probably not going to significantly change the situation in terms of funding of museums. Sponsorship, crowdfunding, increasing prices, shops, catering, restaurants, etc., etc., we will reach a limit, undoubtedly, because there's no example around the world where these approaches have led to a significant transformation of the operating mode of museums. Nevertheless, we really do need to notice a specific feature of museum world, which could apply to the performing arts world as well. There are solutions that we can experiment with, but the challenge is associated with that we could put in danger other key roles, principal roles of museums, such as, for example, increasing entry prices. Well, at that time, we might end up contradicting the need to continue to expand museums. And that's something I'll come back to. So I don't want to give I want to be clear that I'm not giving a pessimistic approach. And so there are things that we can explore. We published in an international review with a colleague an article that shows that if we think outside of the box, there are ways to find room for maneuver and margins. But if we go a bit beyond this discussion and we ask ourselves the question of what the key of better funding for public museum institutions is, I think the key question is around public consent. So the issue becomes to convince our fellow citizens of the importance of museums. But if we work with the existing data, the general data that's available, that tends to have about 50 years of observations history, we can see that despite progress made, some of our fellow citizens do not really feel preoccupied at all by museums. So what happened in the past was that if we attack culture, there was a risk at an electoral level, but now the paradox we're facing, the risk that attacking culture is now not an electoral risk for people in the political world, and that's a change of situation. So is there not something that is linked into our relationship with citizens? Because if I'm a bit more specific in terms of what I'm talking about, if we look at the productions of the Ministry of Culture, 2/3 of our fellow citizens don't go to a museum every year. And so we do need to recognize that there is a challenge for us to establish that museums are the institution that is there to serve society. So we are having difficulty convincing our fellow citizens about this. So I'll wrap up here, but I think there probably are ways that we could move things forward. We are not without options in this challenging situation. Thankfully, we're not out of options. Thank you very much for the transition into question 2, which I wanted to ask everyone, which is linked into this question of the consent of the public. So the second question I want to ask all of the speakers is that beyond the financial issues, it seems essential that the question of funding and support for museums, public and private, should be based on an exchange of values. What are these values for you? Those that form the basis of the museum, those that need to be reminded, stated again, and shared. And so I'm going to hand directly over to Michèle Rivet on this subject. Well, thank you very much. Of course, we work on the basis of values, and it's good to know our enemies, as we heard from Mr. Chougnet. These enemies who give us the strength to come back together to really show who we are, what we want to do. And I think I'd just align in fully with the Prague Museum definition, which clearly says what the values are. Some of these have been added, others have been part of us for a long time, and I've identified 4 values. Of course, there are other values, but I think these values link back into everything that we've been talking about. But of course, you'll need to tell us whether actually there are lots more, or there are other ones, or there are less than these. So I identified accessibility, inclusion, diversity, and sustainability. These are values which, according to the 2022 ICOM definition of museum, and according to the survey that we carried out, these are the values that seem to be the essential values that define museums. So inclusion and accessibility, we saw this in the study that we carried out. We saw to what extent community engagement is becoming so important. Museums have tried to rethink programming, think about pedagogical perspectives, and seek to serve the community. We know this, and I'll come back to this later. Museums around the world, and you've mentioned this, are under increasing scrutiny for their role in perpetuating colonial histories. I'll come back to decolonization later. Sustainability as well. This is a major challenge for museums today. And they need to know whether their green initiatives are sufficient to meet sustainability requirements. As institutions dedicated to preserving cultural heritage, museums are increasingly under pressure to adopt sustainable practices. This includes efforts to reduce carbon footprint, implement energy efficient systems, and promote environmentally friendly exhibitions and programs. And also perhaps just mention the ICOM 2030 action plan, which requires museums to adapt comprehensive sustainable development practices. We could come back to this. It's not always very easy to do, but it really is an essential issue. And it's a value that we really need to have, this value of sustainability in all areas. And then finally, diversity. Diversity leads us directly to this question of decolonization, which has really been presented very clearly, particularly in North American museums. Decolonization links into the restitution of objects, of course, but in its broadest sense, I think it helps us to redefine ourselves as museums. So decolonization means going and get the perspective of other people, the perspective of those who are coming to the museums. It means stepping out of our certainties as curators and museum directors in order to integrate and really connect in to a local population. This connects in, therefore, to inclusion. I think these are the different values that we need to really focus in on that are emerging and are really there. And we could give a whole number of examples around accessibility in terms of the modification of some criteria for accessing museums, for payment, for entry costs. Some museums are charging zero entry fees for vulnerable members of the population, or perhaps for local citizens while asking foreign tourists to pay. There's a whole range of options here which really show how hard museums are working to present and promote these values, which I think are recognized by all museums, at least the museums that we surveyed anyway. Thank you very much, Michèle, for this perspective. I just wanted to hand over now to Guillaume, because you were talking earlier about funding from businesses, but also the creation of circles. I think you mentioned this earlier, but it would be interesting as well for you to talk to us a little bit about how this is being developed and what the resonance issues are and how it's impacting institutions such as the Palais de Tokyo. So there's a lot of things in what you're saying, and I really agree with the fact it's nice to hear about accessibility and sustainability, even though it wasn't very easy just some time ago. But I think these are things that we really need to defend, because I think we are in a key moment in history, and I think more our museums and institutions show, whether these are archaeology museums or contemporary art museums, if they show that they're able to deal directly with social and societal issues and really focus in here. I think the role of artists is really essential, because artists, whether they are artists of the past or artists of the future, have a really key role. We need to create the freedom given to visitors for society, social and societal debate. We don't have closed, definitive answers. In museums, it's still possible to debate. So yes, I talked in terms of big principles, in terms of going beyond the financing or funding. For us, it isn't going beyond, it's the same thing. What I needed was a narrative, and I think we need narratives. We need new narratives. We talk a lot about new narratives, but we've always needed new narratives. We need these narratives. And I think our politicians, and sorry, interpreter corrects himself, the policies are really important. You talked about decolonization, inclusion, accessibility, all of that is really important, as well as the ecological questions. We need to do actions and we need to move forward. And it can be a bit depressing sometimes, because what we do is never quite on the level of the issues that we're facing. But having a narrative without actions is somewhat cynical. So we need a narrative and actions together. Then in terms of the Palais de Tokyo, I decided when I arrived, I decided to write a narrative. I wrote two texts, one on mental health, and then a second text on neurodiversity, mental health, and the institution. And the other one was to do with culture in our institution. I did this without very much care. I wasn't very prudent because I was just arriving, and I raised a whole number of issues, and I knew that this was going to encounter reality, which is not necessarily the good reality, the right reality, but I think this helped us to start moving forward because it made it possible for there to be contradictions, but it also made it possible to clarify where we're going. And I think it's important to really underscore these values. And I think, first of all, with our audiences, but then also with some new partners that we have, there is a basis of work that's really very important. In terms of these values, which you mentioned, I would really underline the importance of new perspectives. I think that artists are champions of creating lots of imagination with very little resources. These are models of ethics and also economic examples as well in the forms that they use and the way that they reach a whole number of people. This has always been the case in society and the social and political world. It's important to remember who we are. We tend, and we do as well in the Palais de Tokyo, we tend to put in place cultural outreach systems, and this is good. That's good. But we need to remember who we are and what art contributes. And we need to separate our outreach, and we never must separate our outreach from the art and what the meaning of what we do. So let's talk about mental health, for example. We've worked on this at all the levels of the institution. It's not like we've got an exhibition and then a cultural outreach around this question, but no, these values need to be all throughout the museum. We cover mental health around the issues associated with the exhibitions, and also about, because we had some exhibitions focused on communities in closed spaces, and particularly psychological areas. And then we welcome people with different mental health situations in the Palais de Tokyo, but it also connects into our teams, because we've trained our teams to mental health first aid. We've got a lot of work that we're doing in this area, and then of course around the management team as well. And so it's all connected in as a whole. And so when you have one thing that you're saying at every level of our rocket, as it were, and I think that's very important. And so therefore that makes it possible to work with some businesses to get their support in these areas. You talked about accessibility. We are working on a season which will be focused in on vulnerability. This is a subject which interests artists, but this season is also going to be an opportunity for us to review our ways of working, and with the support of artists, make it possible for artists to modify our institutions. We need them. So we can step out of this crisis situation, because in these small ecosystems, which are our institutions, we have public service missions, we have businesses. We are places that are home to a particular kind of narrative that we are communicating. And this is something that resonates with the expectations of society today. Thank you, Guillaume. In listening to you were talking earlier about depression. It's true, we can end up with a kind of fatalistic, depressive approach, thinking that nothing can really be done. So I think that would be a real danger. What I also find really interesting in terms of the examples that you've mentioned, we connecting into something of the role of museums as a place for creativity, not just the place of creative works, but also of creativity, and the advantage of creativity is that it's something that is an agent of transformation. Perhaps in terms of what's just been said by Michèle and Guillaume, Valérie and Laurent, perhaps you'd have something to add in. Well, I think I'll come back to more of a pragmatic level, but I think it's important at a daily level. I think that museums, at least in a local area like mine, I think there's something that are very desirable. It's something that makes room for the imaginary. It's a prestigious world with the advantages and the disadvantages associated with that term. And very often we are solicited for works that don't have a lot to do with our missions and our more scientific work. Our work and our role is, of course, to share and to make visible the reasons behind our museum. So here's a very specific example. It's a very ambitious project that we developed with a private sponsor over 2 years. And this was called Wellbeing for Women. And the goal was to welcome women who were in a very vulnerable situation around the question of well-being. We wanted to welcome them into the museum, give them a tour of the museum, particularly in the gardens, and then offer them a workshop around essential oils and then some yoga sessions. It was something that was really trying to rediscover the image of these women and help these women rediscover their image and create a bit of a safe place for them. And we were able to welcome about 200 women. Some came back during feedback sessions at the end of the project, and we wanted to try and develop this project into more of a cultural and artistic approach. So we talked with our sponsor about how we could do that, and we're still talking about that, but we are seeing that it's actually quite difficult for a sponsor who has very clear strategic approaches. It's difficult to develop it outside of this social focus because the sponsor really wanted to develop social work around museums, and this is a project that's been put in place elsewhere. So we're really talking with them, and we're still on this idea of trying to learn how to work together and to align our priorities and needs up together to see how we can make this project move forward. Perhaps that's not going to be possible. We're just going to see what we can do. So all of this is just to say that we can develop partners and find new forms of funding. And sometimes there are restrictions imposed on us through this. I think if you are responding to calls for projects, then you have to fit in the box, and sometimes that can be a bit restricting. Sometimes museums and teams end up basically offering services because funders have more and more requirements. And of course, we're encountering other professions, and this takes a lot of time and can involve a number of restrictions for our teams. Perhaps just to wrap up, I could say that nature abhors a vacuum, and our role is to make our narrative and our actions much more visible and comprehensible. And we need to give ourselves the resources we need in order to be able to go and work off a solid foundation. And museums need to try and take up a place in this galaxy of different players with a very clear identity and very clear projects. In our museum of art and history in Saint-Denis, this involved 3 phases. First of all, it was writing out the scientific and cultural project where we tried to bring together the team and as many elected officials as possible. Perhaps we'll come back to that later. That was the first key phase. And then the second phase was involving programming with a new museography approach. And once again, this is about narrative offered to our visitors, and then also the question of cultural programming, which was a bit more original and innovative. And then finally, there was a final point that we're working on, was a communication strategy. And here we're thinking about a new name and a new visual identity for the museum. And I think that's something that's really very important for positioning ourselves out for discussing with potential partners.
And perhaps now I should hand over to our next speaker. Yes, I just wanted to give you some examples to embody this greater. So I think that we all have more or less the same values. I think another important notion where we do need to make good progress is representativeness. How can we talk about inclusion, decolonization, how we can be certain that we're giving greater visibility to certain categories of the population? How can we do that if we do not have good representation? So 70% of the population doesn't go to museums, apparently. Perhaps if in the teams there were more people representing our society, if it was more representative, I think that this is something that we could really begin to work on in order to reach out to new members of the public. Let me give you three recent examples, not of representativeness, but of social inclusion. In the current context, the first case with the heat waves this summer, there were two heat waves in Bordeaux. Working in line with the local area, we had an area in our basement that was opened up to homeless people so that they could keep cool. We wanted to provide support. So the authorities here are saying that this might need to become a more long-term solution in public institutions to have a refuge for homeless people that really do take the full brunt of these heat waves. That's one example. The second example is that in the past 3 years, we've been working with uh, children, young people who have left home, and these are nomads. These people are paid every day, so they work on different tasks such as painting in the library. So they have 1 day assignments. It could be a variety of different work. So this is as part of a resocialization and reintegration program for these young people. This helps them to have a better self-esteem. This can also help fight people's preconceptions as well, because it's not always easy for teams to come across someone with a huge mohawk in the corridors every day. So this is something that's needing to be worked on both sides of the coin. This is the third year of this program. It's called Tapage, and it's a temporary work program for young people. Another thing that we're doing for reintegration is solidarity lunches on Thursday lunchtime. So yesterday morning, for the third or fourth time, we opened up our doors to vulnerable people who came to have breakfast at the Musée d'Aquitaine. They also had a free visit. It's really interesting, and we had some great discussions about what they're doing. And I think that this is another dimension of trying to open up museums to larger audiences to vulnerable audiences as well. We want to make sure that the door is a lot easier to breach for every member of the public. Jean-Michel, I would love to hear your point of view before we go on to the final question in our panel discussion. Thank you so much. I do not doubt that museums have a significant role in contemporary societies, but as I suggested earlier, the desire is to have greater support by citizens. I think we're going to need to demonstrate that we are producing more services in order to support residents and those outside. If we are unable to convince citizens to take part in activities organized by the museum, we're going to struggle because we will be losing the support of public authorities. Elected officials listen to their electorate, those who vote for them. It's not difficult because museums have all of the characteristics that we need to be able to do this. We need to show how museum action is aligned with public policy, whether it's in education, social, as you were saying, or in the environmental, tourist areas, economy, attractiveness. Museums have a lot to say in public policy. And if this recognition is established by elected officials, I'm not worried because I'm sure that these officials will give us the resources that we need. Obviously, we need to avoid being instrumentalized. That's a significant issue, but we are far from that. I wanted to come back to an area which is members of the public that may struggle to get through the door. This is important, but we've been working in this field over the past 10 years, and there are limits to these schemes. It has not been proven that work with members of the public that are further away from museums results in an increase in the number of visitors in museums. I also have questions about the ecological transition, not because it is not legitimate, but because I think that this is the role of all public infrastructure, sports equipment, infrastructure, education, etc. So sometimes the weight, the amount of investment in digital services, there are a lot of things that need to be investigated. We're not going to refuse these new instruments, but the idea should be to conserve a certain distance. Regarding income now, there's this idea that we need to convince elected officials that museums have to be able to increase their own income. Yes and no, it depends. There are some museums, such as large institutions, that can generate a lot of income, but for others, it's very difficult. And we need to remain aware of this. Public reading libraries are not at all subject to this request for their own income. Public reading libraries, once again, only have income of around 1, 2, or 3%. That means that 97% of their funding needs to come from public funds. So why are elected officials differentiating between museums and libraries? It's because libraries have had considerable success. We need to recognize this. We were talking earlier about the recognition of museums in the public space. The role played by libraries that museums could play more as places where people can get together and impact a lot of citizens. We can see that the emergence of new techniques with Amazon and Google, etc., they may have disrupted libraries for a time. There was the question about whether they were going to retain their position in society, but this has not been called into question. Quite the contrary. What I would suggest, and here the question is quite simple. Some citizens believe that museums are not for them, whether they are right or wrong. We need to look at all of the reasons why these people might think this, wrongly so, and we need to ensure that, on the contrary, our citizens can recognize that museums are designed for them, that they can feel at home. So we need to be working on the attractiveness of museums. I'm not talking about tourist attraction. I'm talking about how to be attractive to citizens as well. So let me come back to this idea of members of the public far from museums. They have there's limited resources in museums, particularly human resources. The Minister of Culture is calling into question rethinking some of these aspects as well as us. We need to be working with different entities in order to reach these members of the public, popular education federations, social and educative organizations, etc. Organizations of youth and culture, for instance, where that still exists. This will help us to reach members of the public that don't necessarily know much about museums alongside our captive audience. Thank you so much. You really have anticipated our next point. It is almost midday, and we're going to need to move on to the third question to leave enough time for questions. This third question really does talk about our relationship with elected officials. This is linked to relationship with local populations. You were talking about libraries. There's Bibliofolie. This is an event that has been created in France to celebrate libraries, and the Ministry of France has carried out studies that have shown that libraries are a place of social encounter, bringing people together, both educated and uneducated people come there. Some people are there just to doodle, to talk to their friends. It really is a place of life. I think this link between museums and libraries is not as strong as it could be in France. Some reasons I understand and others I do not. I think we could imagine something quite fruitful in having a deeper link between both sides, because the very local, territorial, lively side of libraries is not something that we have identified yet. Guillaume identified earlier that museums on the other side of the Atlantic are showing that they're more subversive actors than we could imagine, because they're stigmatized by the authorities in place at the moment. This may seem surprising. Around 2 weeks ago, the Minister of Heritage was saying that it's easy because they're on the right, like society, but perhaps they're not as fixed on the political spectrum than we thought, which is great. We don't want to do politics here, but the idea of having a subversive museum that's complex, thinking about a museum able to act, recognized by authorities, even though they want to destroy them, this is a form of recognition. So I wanted to ask Laurent and Valérie about these issues. I learnt this expression earlier where you said that you wanted to have museums put at the heart of the village, and this is what Guillaume was saying earlier about librarians as well. Perhaps you could say that. And Valérie, perhaps we could conclude on this. Today, you're building a new scientific and cultural project with elected officials and populations. So Laurent first and then Valérie. Does that work? And then we will open up to questions. Yes, comparisons with libraries are very interesting. We don't necessarily have the same infrastructure or equipment, but I think there is a lot that we could observe and work on with libraries. This is a very open place, and I think beyond the financial aspect, there are a lot of people that think that they're going to be bored if they go to a museum. And then there is also this kind of image of a dusty old museum that we still see in different discussions. This is an important aspect. Placing museums at the heart of the village, as we said, really relies on being representative. That's at the heart of this system. I like using the term ecosystem. So this refers to all the partners with whom we can work. So friends of museums. This is interesting. Smaller museums try to work with young people as well, and I think that's interesting. It's about ensuring the future of our institutions as well. We regularly mention this. It's not easy, but to have a community of users where we have the three pillars of the eco museum. It's not easy, but it's something that we need to implement. We're finishing our PSE, our program, and we're going to try to be doing this with residents across Bordeaux and perhaps the region as well. We're trying to expand this. We don't know how yet. With the support of our authority, we're going to be exploring different opportunities for this. Another issue that's already been mentioned, I really like this idea of concentric circles. If we start working within our team on its diversity at all levels, trying to work collectively on a project, I think that's a really good basis to then be able to expand. So like I say, this is concentric circles. Then we could move into the local area, into the neighborhood, working with local retailers, local shopkeepers, in order to expand our brand in a positive way across the local area. And then using concentric circles, capillary networks, we're going to be able to expand to work with residents across the zone that we're trying to represent and bring people into museums. It's interesting you're talking about these circles, and there are two examples. Magval is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, and the young mediators recruited for Magval 20 years ago from Vitry, Ivry, and other neighborhoods. If they were 20 or 25 years old then, they're around 40, 45 years old now. So this is very interesting. We can see the local roots as these young people that were not anything to do with the museum, but were trained and developed by the museum. They were able to really demonstrate their attachment to the museum when it celebrated its anniversary during the music festival. Another example is architectural. So this Jean-Michel and Laurent, you were talking about this, having a glass area where people can come into, and the creation of committees of users. With the Louvre-Lens, the community of users worked with this on all different aspects. So for the Gothic exhibition at the moment, the booklet was actually written by the committee of users. I'm working as a curator, a co-curator on this. We intentionally gave up this booklet to this group. I just wanted to mention these two examples because I think that they're interesting. And this is where we didn't necessarily go in Vitré or in Lens in the Pas-de-Calais northern region. So, Valérie, could you perhaps give some examples and mention this public consultation as well? Yes, this process does not happen by itself. In Vitré, we have populations that have high levels of fragility. This is one of the poorest regions in France. Thinking that we had around the scientific and cultural project was on the request of elected officials. We wanted to think about how we could replace museums and its content into the local area. How can we make museums an interesting place, a place where residents can recognize themselves, where they can contribute and also learn, and a place above all where people feel comfortable, where they can come even if it's just for a few minutes, where they can spend an afternoon, where they can read, where they can talk to their friends. So before the scientific and cultural project, we wanted to make the museum an open space. We wanted to make all of the permanent exhibitions free and also offer some services, meaning that people could come to the museum to grab a coffee, to wander around the gift shop. We wanted to make it a completely open area without people having to come to the museum to visit culture or heritage. So that was the first major strategy of the project. And the second was to think about the narrative. For those of you who know this museum, it's in a religious building from the 18th century. It's got rich heritage, but it is now perceived in a very fractured manner. There's not necessarily coordination between different objects. And so we had to think about the narration. We had to think about the story that we would be telling, first of all, to our residents and then to visitors. For this, we were supported by a multidisciplinary scientific committee. This was very rich, and we had different formats and ways of working. So there were two orders. The first was to have a reflection on the existing collection, to think about why they were at Saint-Denis. Obviously, it was consistent, and by listening to the different researchers supporting us, we were able to rebuild bridges between existing collections. And the second strategy was to expand our themes as well. We are in a prestigious medieval city, of course, but it is also one of the largest industrial areas. There are people who have come from the entire world. There's parts of the city that have experienced deindustrialization. There's a significant political history there as well. Questions about how we can live together and come together around a common denominator really is essential in our city. So our scientific project was built around this new narrative with very concrete avenues that were identified. The long-term aim of this was to fully renovate the building. It is quite deteriorated at the moment. This is not going to happen immediately next year, but we are receiving support from officials, elected officials, but we also need to show that we are able to transform our museum to think about new ways of explaining heritage. We have a temporary exhibition building, which is kind of like a prefiguration of what the museum could be. I'm not going to go into details, but we had an exhibition on Sonia Delaunay's fabrics. working with a factory in Saint-Denis. We're going to be doing an exhibition on Deliver Us from Evil, about things that can go wrong in our bodies. We're doing a call for collection with residents on this, and an ethnological survey among practitioners in the area. So this is a topic that is going to allow us to talk about our different beliefs, the things we find important in order to take a different look at religious practice as well. I think this is going to be quite rich, and it is going to draw in new members of the public, perhaps even young people and teenagers that we struggle to get into museums. Next year, we'll be working on an exhibition on hip hop, and we're going to be building this with La Ligne 13 hip hop venue, and we'll be working with the Rai Cathedral around urban culture. We have participatory surveys with the Paris 8. I gave you some examples with the university earlier, but we want to try to understand what makes hip hop special in Saint-Denis, what heritage we have here, and how this is experienced by younger people. So we want to be a museum rooted in our local area with topics that can interest our residents and help attract the support of our elected officials. I just wanted to say one last thing. Laurent, I really appreciated what you said. In the museum team today, we have colleagues that discovered our museum while they were at school, because we do have a huge number of school groups, and I can feel that they have specific attachment to the museum because of the visits that they had while they were children. Yes, and in Saint-Denis, young people represent around two-thirds of the population, if I'm not mistaken. There's around 500,000 residents there as well. So this is very significant. So thank you very much. Thank you to all five of you. You all gave us messages of hope. Yes, there's crisis, but you have the ability to overcome, to reinvent yourselves, to act from inside with a significant reflection that you've been able to share. It's been incredibly interesting. I think we should now move on to the questions and answer session, where we will be interacting with people in the room here in Versailles, but also with those online. Over to you. We can't really see you from here, so please do identify yourselves. It's quite difficult to see you. Good morning, Caroline Coll. I am a teacher at a university working in curatorship and heritage. I am delighted to have heard examples of action, and it's been quite comforting and encouraging to hear the examples that you shared. I just wanted to raise your attention to two major issues that I've identified in recent years in my museum practice and observation, which is mainly in Paris, and the museums in Paris, the national museums, the Paris museums, etc. And these two missteps, if you like, are associated with financial issues. So first of all, there is over attendance of tourist members. So there are some museums in Paris where we're no longer welcomed as citizens. We have to elbow our way through, fight our way through. The visitor conditions are just horrible. What's the relationship with works, with others under these conditions of hyper consumption? And I think that this is a trend. Almost all of the exhibitions that I did this summer in Paris, I faced this kind of situation. Another misstep that's perhaps even more worrying is that in the past couple of years, I've visited 3 exhibitions in 3 different institutions where I was confronted with historical counterfacts about geopolitical situations ongoing. linked to funding by foreign authorities of these exhibitions. So I just wanted us to really rejoice in the good initiatives, but that we also really do pay attention to these two missteps.
I don't know whether there's an answer really that you're looking for in terms of the question of too many visitors. I think that's something that's being encountered by many museums in Paris and elsewhere, because what's going on in the Pompidou, at the Musée d'Orsay, and the Louvre at the moment, these are big museums that are really thinking through these questions. In terms of the examples that you're talking about of false narratives presented by museums, I don't know the specific examples you're talking about, but it's true that funding could impact the curatorial presentation of exhibitions. So perhaps this is something we could talk about in more detail later on, perhaps. I think there was another question. I'm Anna Marant, Deputy Director of the Bourges Museums. I just wanted to come back to the title of this round table, because when we think about the role of museums and their cultural programming, generally our elected officials in towns and cities, they generally are in favor of this. They want things to happen. They want lots of things to be done. And so teams do contribute to this, sometimes even beyond what is actually possible and feasible. So that creates a tension with the other missions of museums, because we'd also like to have time to finish our stock taking, cataloging work, which is our first one that we're still trying to do. We'd like to have time to do that. And it's difficult to help elected officials understand that beyond the partnerships with different associations and institutions, the social work and the connection with penitentiary institutions and other work, there's also work to be done on the collections. And I think here we could talk about an adjustment variable when we talk about investment, when we are faced with needs for new storage areas and we need to renovate our museums. And here we are clearly competing with other policies, which of course makes sense. There's work to be done in schools and stadiums and heritage. So many things need to be funded. The 2028 European Capital of Culture, where we are, is being funded. And at that point, in terms of investment, it's difficult to align with and to fill our missions, and also to align with our regulatory requirements, because there are no storage areas, because museums are closed. And this raises the question of the fundamental question about whether museums are a necessity in our local areas. Thank you very much for that observation and for this comment, Laura. Yes, perhaps just very briefly, I could say something. I'm afraid I don't have a miracle solution, but in terms of this situation, I think there is work that could be done, a lot of work that could be done around intercultural work. I think what I mean by this is that I think that sometimes museums face a number of different stereotypes and prejudices, and some of the fundamental roles are somewhat invisible, because a lot of our collections are in storage. And I would really like to encourage us to try and help people discover this invisible aspect and this fundamental work, which is really very important in terms of attractivity, and ultimately in terms of resources. So do organize meetings of executive boards of companies in your premises to invite them to see your collections. I think there is work to be done on the ground with colleagues from other departments as well within the local authorities. And I think here there is work to be done more upstream. This would be more in terms of training. I think that today in training for curators in local authorities, I think there's not enough training alongside administrators, where I think for library administrators, I think there's quite a lot of training put in place, but I think there's a lot to be done in this area. Perhaps you will say you see, perhaps I'm seeing this from, you might say that I'm saying this the wrong way around, but I think there is work to be done to make visible what a museum is and how museums can fit into cross-cutting public policies. Michèle, I think you wanted to say something too? Yes, I think totally aligned with that. I think museums need to raise their profile, help people to understand who they are, what they're doing. It's about role advocacy, which is really essential so that museums can step up, because museums are third spaces after home and work. Museums are a third space, and there's been a lot of research done on these kind of spaces. It's a place where you go to rest, to talk, to meet people. It's kind of a panoply of, it's a place of a panoply of different activities. So an example of a museum where I work is a place for pop music concerts on a Friday evening to bring young people in. All of these different roles of museums have a role. It's important that we communicate these roles and we show that we can take up these roles. And I think that will make us increase our priority position in public funding. I think that's what we have seen when museums do advocacy. When they start saying who they are and what they're doing, they get better known, they receive more respect from the public authorities and more funding. This we saw in our study. Perhaps I could just add another comment as well, is that we were talking about partnerships earlier on. I think it's also really important to be very careful in terms of the partnerships with whom we work, because we know the British Museum, for example. I think partnerships need to be aligned with our missions, and we really need to make sure that's the case. And we also need to have reports from these partnerships in order to be able to evaluate them. So I can see people saying, yes, we should never have a kind of open partnership. We need to know who our partners are, why they're our partners, how long they're going to be our partners, and evaluate the role that they're going to play. Thank you. Yes, that's something that's very important. Evaluation is really very important, because often in a lot of the work that we do in museums, the part that we miss out is evaluation, so that we can communicate about what's been done. I think that's something really important. Jean-Michel, I think you might want to say something on that. You've got the microphone. In terms of elected officials, they have democratic legitimacy. Well, that's the case. So I'm not sure that we need to kind of try and evangelize them, as it were. I think we need to understand their role, but perhaps what we can do is share a vision with the elected officials, because they're open to helping us, letting us present to them how we see the museum in a few years. And once you've shared this vision, you could share something of a strategic approach with different scenarios. So at each stage, we can mobilize elected officials and they can give their perspective. And so if they approve then this strategy, then we can imagine that they will back that up with resources and the resources necessary. It's true as well that in a town like Bourges, and there might be a number of different examples, the fact that you have museums that are closed would be something that's really quite concerning. So even though I don't think about Bourges, I think a lot of French towns, there is a need to think about pooling and bringing people together. What I mean is that either in a few years' time or very quickly, what we will see is administrative reorganization based around rationalization of budgetary decisions, or the museum professionals get ahead of the game and make a proposal to elected officials that we could think together about putting more institutions together and pooling them. Because what's the point of having a number of different small institutions that are struggling when we could have one or two institutions that have a significant critical mass at a cultural level, tourist level, educational level, etc. Any other questions or comments? I think we're going to need to conclude in order to leave time for the translators to rest before we pick up again. So thank you to all 5 of you. Thank you to all of you who have been following along in the room and have been following online.